I just want you to walk me through your last 24 hours. Absolute chaos in Milwaukee. Adrian Griffin out, Doc Rivers in. You don't really see this much with a second-place team and a mid-season hiring of a brand-new head coach. Like, total chaos, dude. Walk me through it.
You summed it up pretty well. I
Yeah.
mean, I think you had certainly heard the external chatter that was out there, and I had a number of people point to me. I can't remember what day it was last week, but just, oh, did you hear what Stephen A. Smith was saying during the broadcast at halftime? So it was clearly out there. And I had talked about it with a few others, including our pal and teammate Eric Name, that we both kind of questioned, this. I get that growth is not always linear, and you don't go here's the steady progress, but we saw none in terms of the progress. And I think that was the troubling thing when you think about the expectations for this team, that you were kind of assuming at some point it's got to kick into gear, right? And I think if you would have swapped January and how it started with December, we're not having as many of these conversations. They probably still exist, but that was the big thing, is you had clearly taken a step backward. And I don't know if I would go as far as saying he lost the locker room. I've seen a lot of people jump to that, but the message just wasn't being received. And they kind of had to deal with the reality of I know the record's great. We're not playing to expectations. And that schedule is going to get a whole lot more difficult. That they have the most difficult remaining schedule in the league. The Celtics have, I think, the second easiest from this point forward. So it's not just Boston. Philly was in the middle of the pack, Cleveland as well. So if you were just kind of plateauing here and not reaching that growth you were striving for, there was a very real risk of, man, by the time this schedule picks up, we could be fighting for fourth or fifth place, or potentially worse in the Eastern Conference when we see some of the moves that were already made.
Yeah, that's well said. And I mentioned it right before you hopped on, JG. But the fascinating part about this to me is, and you mentioned you don't think he necessarily lost the locker room, but this was kind of a Giannis guy, right? Like, Giannis advocated for Adrian Griffin's hiring in the offseason, and only 43 games into the season, he's out. So I wonder, and I don't know if you have the answer, but I wonder what kind of role Giannis had in his dismissal. Because if you're allowing the Pistons, who, by the way, the other night hung 135 points on the Bucks, I don't know what the breaking point was, but I wonder what Giannis's role in all of this was.
I don't have the answer to that in terms of the dismissal of Adrian Griffin. The 135, I think that was. I don't know if we can even say alarming, because it's what we had come to expect from this team. But we kind of joked and pointed to, you got 2 games in Detroit. These should be get right games. It's a bad offense. It's clearly a bad team with talent. They have the worst record in the league. But it's a Pistons team that averaged 10 threes a game and is not very high scoring, doesn't shoot at a high percentage. And look, it was a bit of an outlier game on Saturday when they hit 21 threes and shot close to 60%. The problem is, it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf, that when those outlier performances do pop up, you don't really have a receptive audience to it with the way that they played. So those 2 games did not go as expected. You won, but it wasn't the aesthetically pleasing win that you were hoping to see. As far as the hire of him, look, it just kind of illustrates, too, how difficult it is to hire somebody in sports and a head coach. And the Packers are going to go through it with a defensive coordinator.
Right.
But it's imperative you don't screw it up, especially when you have a once-in-a-generation type of talent like Giannis, and you're a team vying for a championship. It's easy to fire coaches, because when you fire a coach, you're making the right decision for the most part, that it's reached the point where it's time. But hiring is the most difficult part, in finding the right one. I've seen a lot of people point out, too, this was Giannis's pick. I never felt comfortable signing off that this is 100% Giannis's decision.
Sure.
Was he involved? Absolutely. Chris Middleton, all these guys, that when you have a veteran team, they're going to have some involvement and some say. There was an interesting report from Mark Stein, which is kind of more akin to some of the things that a lot of us had heard over the summer, that Giannis didn't necessarily choose Adrian Griffin as much as he may have dictated I don't want this guy in Nick Nurse. And I
Okay.
heard some things about maybe the well being poisoned for Giannis by some players in Toronto that experienced Nick Nurse that I would assume was part of that story there. However, I think if you ask Joel Embiid and company, they don't have a problem with Nick Nurse
True that.
now. But that was the tough part, and it kind of goes back to what we saw with the Holiday move too, where Giannis kind of played the role of, I just don't want to know. Like, if it's going to make us better, fine. He's my brother. He's my teammate. I obviously would rather him be here. If you're going to make a move, don't involve me, so I don't get my emotions tied up into it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I appreciate the clarification. Like I said this when you couldn't hear me, which I'm going to repeat it to you now because I want to make you blush. You know a hell of a lot more than me on all this. This is why we bring you in to talk about it, because this is not my bread and butter. It is yours. So I trust your opinion on this stuff a lot more than mine. So when it comes to Doc Rivers, like this, hold on. Before we actually get to Doc Rivers, were you familiar with CNN Sports, Justin? I had no idea what the hell that was.
You and me both. We all had to kind of look up, like, wait, is this Bleacher Report? Is this TNT? Like, what is CNN Sports? On the day that Sports Illustrated basically goes by CNN Sports is out here breaking news. So yeah, that was a bit of a head scratcher. I mean, when you saw that report, I very limited context and no Eric name, but the few that I had, I did try to confirm too. Like, is this legit? And was told, like, it's going to happen, but this report is not the one to go with. So as we eventually found, that was the case. And you know, with the amount of chatter around Doc Rivers and just the fact that the Bucks are in this spot, that I think I mentioned this somewhere else. If this was, ironically enough, 6 years ago when Joe Prunty first took over as an interim coach, almost 6 years to the day, you could have done something like that where Joe Prunty was your interim for the remainder of the season because it was a younger team and you weren't necessarily championship or bust. But because of the age of this group and because, you know, your window, you don't know how much longer it's open. I think realistically you had to approach this season saying we have a 2-year window. Anything outside of that, great. It's even better. But these 2 years, this year and next year, are where we really have to do something. And because of that, you can't go at it with an interim coach for the remainder of the year, that you're not in the luxury, or you don't have the luxury of saying, let's wait until better candidates open up over the summer and find what's the best fit for this roster. You just kind of have to say, we got to make the best of what's out there now. And I do think, as much as I think it's been somewhat polarizing, obviously people will point to the track record in the playoffs and what I think it's 14 or 15 and 32, something like that, Doc Rivers' record in closeout games. People are going to point to that. But even with that, I do think he is clearly the best option that is out there right now. And I think the biggest thing is, I mean, number one, it's going to be a clear upgrade over Adrian Griffin because he's an experienced coach.
Yep.
And that's what you need right now. But also, you know, as much as we like to rebel against it because we're Milwaukee and we're the small town team and we have Giannis, who's the Mr. Loyalty guy, the Bucks are a super team. You can't make a trade for Damian Lillard when you already have the 2-time MVP and Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez as your third and fourth options. You can't build that roster and not think you're a super team. And the track record for success immediately with super teams, I think that was always the point of caution, was it usually takes some time. And I think that's kind of what we witnessed for large portions of this season. But Doc Rivers is the type of guy I think you would want with that type of roster because of his experience managing stars, managing egos. I think people can oftentimes misconstrue that ego word as being negative only when it's not. But Doc knows how to manage those personalities and egos and stars, and that's what kind of team you are. That's kind of what you need.
You're totally right on that. And I love the word super team, or the use of the term super team, because the expectations have to be massive, because you mentioned the window, JG, right? Like it's not a very long window. I think Giannis and Dame, correct me if I'm wrong, they're under contract this season and the following two. That's not a very long window. So you got to bring in somebody that's experienced. It's not like you can just figure it out. You want to win now. It's a win now mode. And that explains why you make an in-season hiring. But my next question then is Doc Rivers a long-term solution, or is Doc Rivers a this year solution we'll revisit after whatever happens in the postseason?
I would imagine we'll hear more from John Horst today, who is slated to speak to the media in the time slot that is typically reserved for the head coach.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine that question will be one of the first, if it hasn't already trickled out, that gets asked. I got to believe it's a long-term, or at least as long-term as this group is together, because not just Doc Rivers, but any coach, I don't really see a rush to jump in to coach a team with these expectations that just fired their coach in the season under the understanding of like, let's see how it goes. And then if we like it in the summer, we'll give you an extension and re-up you. So I think you have to view this as Doc Rivers is tied to Giannis and Damian Lillard and this core of the Bucks in this window, that Doc's going to be your coach basically for the duration of this group being together.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I may have been duped. I don't know if this is a real report, so I'm gonna ask you because you're gonna be my fact checker on this. Right? Did the Bucks ask Doc Rivers to speak with Adrian Griffin during the in-season tournament? Did I read that somewhere, or am I making that up?
Well, that was the report, and I've seen it from a few people, and I even had somebody tell me yesterday, unaffiliated with the Bucks, that knew somebody that had a relationship with the Majerus family and with Doc Rivers, that said, "Hey, did you know Doc Rivers is working as a consultant?" And the first time I heard that, I was like, "No, this can't possibly be true." And then those reports came out from Chris Haynes and a few others. So evidently, I've seen a lot of people jump to the, man, did Doc Rivers sabotage Adrian Griffin? And I don't think that was the case. I think the way that it was framed, the setup was, we need somebody to kind of mentor him and work with him because these are such lofty expectations. And that was always I guess you could say strange, but that was always the thing that I think raised eyebrows. Was he checked a lot of boxes, Adrian Griffin did, in that when you go back to his introductory press conference, media day, our first interactions with him, he said everything you wanted to hear when it was, hey, we're going to play different styles of defense. We're going to make adjustments throughout the game. We're going to be well prepared. We're going to find opponent weaknesses and attack those. And those are all things that most Bucks fans, while you appreciated the way that Mike Budenholzer made this a better team and raised their floor, those would be the things you pointed to say, well, we really saw none of that. So I think you heard that and thought, great, perfect. There was the connection with Giannis and the players. And again, I don't think this was Giannis saying, this is my guy, hire him. But I just go back to last year when you hear more chatter from players about Darvin Ham and how much they missed him and his presence with that team and in the locker room. As an African-American coach with a roster of predominantly African-American players, a former player, his ability to relate to that group, his ability to be the guy that could play bad cop at times and deliver tough news, I think that was what they were sorely missing. It was still a very good staff, but you were missing that one piece. And I think that kind of loomed over them in this decision as well of, we got to find somebody that is going to relate to the players, because we heard that chatter constantly. And again, of those three finalists, while you could make a strong case, is Nick Nurse the best coach? Probably, right? In terms of his tactician ability and X's and O's, yes, I think that's hard to deny. Kenny Atkinson is an experienced coach, was part of Bud's staff prior to Milwaukee, and did a great job with a very young Brooklyn Nets team that had minimal expectations. But he doesn't have that playing career either, whereas Adrian Griffin does. And there's a lot of things that Giannis could relate to with Adrian Griffin. And not just Giannis, again, the players. And I think that was the big part of it, where you realize, yeah, it does make sense in that sense, that it checks a number of boxes. But, man, I can't remember the last time we saw a team with expectations high as these are hiring a coach with as little experience as a head coach as the Bucks just did, because it's not just at the NBA level. He had never been a head coach anywhere, that there was no G League or college or any of that experience to lean on when you're in that spot. And I've seen people make the David Blatt comparison. I think it's the closest. But, David Blatt also had a full year prior to getting fired. It wasn't his first year. And Ime Udoka, Ime Udoka took that team there, and that was his first year as a coach. yes, Ime Udoka did a great job, but the Celtics didn't enter that season with championship expectations.
All good points. Something my mind keeps going back to is around the time we last talked. It was right after the Dame trade. And, that was right around when Terry Stotts left the team. He was an assistant coach, obviously had the head coaching experience in Portland. And he kind of left the team. It kind of got swept under the rug because the season started. And obviously there's all the excitement around Dame and Giannis being teammates and this team with championship expectations again. That move sits weirder with me now that 43 games in, Adrian Griffin was fired. And what the hell went down there? Did we ever really get a full story on what happened there? And I would imagine, right, if Stotts is still with the team and Griffin's out, Stotts is probably the interim, and I don't know if they're making a hire. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's where my head's gone since this news came out yesterday.
As far as the last point, I mean, that's tough to dispute, especially given the relationship that Stotts has with Damian Lillard. And, the fact, too, that everybody talks about Stotts, the offensive coach, and that's certainly a strength, but we also neglect to mention, a handful of those years, he at least got a respectable defense, and I think a top 10 defensive rating one of those years with the Blazers when the backcourt was C.J. McCollum and Damian Lillard, so not exactly a defensive-minded group that you had. And yeah, it's hard not to think if Terry Stotts was still on staff that he wouldn't be the guy taking over. In terms of what happened, I don't think it was just one thing. Is that incident that was reported on from that shoot around in the preseason before that game in Oklahoma City? Because the few people, I wasn't there, obviously, I don't travel with the team, but the few I know that were there and on the court had told me I didn't even notice anything happened. So I don't think it was just as simple as a blow up that happened on the court as he was instructing Dame and Giannis a little more. I think there's more to it. And he was not a guy that had any history with Adrian Griffin. It was not Adrian Griffin's choice. I don't know if I would use the words forced, but it was certainly the front office saying, look, all those things we just went through, this is your first time as a head coach. We need to win a championship. We do need to fill out a staff that we feel gives you a support system as well. So that's why you saw immediately Terry Stotts and Joe Prunty. But that's also the challenge is, it's like doing a talk show too, that you can't just say this guy and this girl or these two, we're going to pair them together. It'll be fine. You need that chemistry and you need that history and you need to be able to bounce off of each other. And I just don't think that was ever the case. I mean, not just personality-wise with their fit, but if you're Adrian Griffin, I'm sure he was cognizant, too, of the fact of this guy could potentially be my replacement if things go south. And if you're Terry Stotts, too, you were a head coach for nearly a decade. I know he has a track record of being an assistant, but his last stop was, a 9-year run in Portland and took some time off, but then you return to the sidelines as an assistant, not just coaching, any job that can be difficult where you're no longer the guy and everything you're used to doing. Well, great. I mean, we'll take the input, but it's ultimately not your call. So please just do what I tell you to do.